So let me just start by saying, I never knew Final Fantasy growing up. I didn't have any video games or even internet during my childhood, if you can believe it. Games are a genre that I've only really gotten into in the past few years, and the only game series I have any kind of nostalgia for at all is Sonic the Hedgehog. And while I do love that series, I do still kind of feel it's as much of a mixed bag as everyone else does, with plenty of games I love, but also plenty of games I hate. Final Fantasy was the first series I was introduced to that I completely fell in love with. I started with Final Fantasy III on the Nintendo DS when I was 15, and while I was initially a bit put off by the random encounters and the turn-based system, I quickly became obsessed with it, playing it for several months on end. From there, I would eventually continue through the rest of the series and be blown away each and every time. Before Final Fantasy, I never had any idea that video games could have proper fleshed out stories or characters I could fall completely in love with. It's my favourite game series of all time, it's a series I can't get enough of, and honestly, I just want to talk about it. So while this may be an extremely different video from the channel, I hope you enjoy it, because if I can love Transformers enough to make videos about them, I want to be able to do the same for Final Fantasy. So, where better to start than with number 1. Final Fantasy I, released in 1987 for the Famicom before being localized for the NES in 1990. At least for America. Here in Europe we wouldn't be able to get it until 2003. While it may seem quaint now, Final Fantasy was a big deal for its company Square at the time, as Square hadn't been in a lot of success at this point. Created by Hironobu Sakaguchi with character design by Yoshitaka Amano, music by Nobuo Uematsu, and sprite design by Kazuko Shibuya, this was Square's final effort to make it big, which is why it was named Final Fantasy. If it was a success, good for them. If it wasn't, at least they tried. At least that's the generally accepted reason behind the name. Apparently that's not the entire story, but it's a great name regardless. Now this game has been remade and remastered several times, including the Origins version on PlayStation 1, the Dawn of Souls remake on GBA and PSP, and most recently the Pixel remaster on mobile and Steam. My first experience with Final Fantasy I, however, was with the original NES version. You see, while I loved Final Fantasy III, it wasn't until Some Call Me Johnny started marathoning the games in 2021 that I really started to want to give the rest of the series a shot. So I decided to just jump right into the NES game with the intention of sticking it through to the end. I then proceeded to play for about 2 hours before getting bored and dropping it. The battles were slow, I had no clue where to go, and back then I had no idea that there was a map, or that you could speed the battle text up. Whoops. So not the best start, but it was probably for the best, because I then decided that since I'd already played 3, it might make more sense to continue from there and begin with Final Fantasy IV. And while my experience with that game is its own story, it ended up being a much better decision. I would revisit and finish Final Fantasy I later though, this time with the PSP remake. I don't remember much of that playthrough besides finding the final boss really hard, but I don't think I came out of it with the best opinion on the game. For this revisit though, I decided to challenge myself and reattempt that original NES version. Partly because I had unfinished business with this version, but also because I just wanted to experience the first ever release in its original form. Also, just to get this out of the way, I did use an emulator to record the footage, and while it was pretty good for the most part, it did leave this small little game controller thing in the bottom of the screen which I couldn't figure out how to get rid of, so yeah, I'm sorry about that, just try to ignore it, you'll be okay. Now, despite my previous experiences with this game, I went in with an open mind, and will try and give leeway when I can, seeing as it's the first in the series and was released on such a limited console. I won't deny though that there was a bit of trepidation going into this one. NES games have a reputation for being extremely hard, as well as often being extremely unclear, and I was worried I'd end up having a really bad time and end up regretting the idea halfway through. But to my surprise, that didn't happen. Final Fantasy I, while it certainly has its problems, is a solid game. But before we get into that, let's start off with the plot. And well, there's not much. Despite the massively compelling and emotional stories that future games would present, Final Fantasy I is very bare bones. There is a premise and dialogue, but there are no cutscenes and even less characters to develop. The main plot details in this game are only really delivered in these occasional walls of text that occasionally pop up. Regardless, there is still a plot of some sort, so let's cover it. The natural elements of the world are controlled by 4 elemental crystals. Orbs. 1 for earth, 1 for fire, 1 for water, and 1 for wind. Over the last 400 years, the orbs have become corrupted and are now starting to cause problems for the world around them. The earth is rotting, the wind has stopped, the oceans have gone wild, and the fire isn't mentioned in this wall of text. But hope is not lost, as it is foretold that 4 warriors of light will one day materialize completely out of nowhere and free the crystals from the darkness that has tainted them. And just like that, boom! You are given control of the 4 heroes, and it's your job to find each of those orbs. The journey begins outside the kingdom of Conaria, where the Princess Sarah has just been kidnapped by the kingdom's most respected knight, Garland. Why'd she do it? No clue. But the whole kingdom has gone into depression, and the queen has even locked herself in her own room, except no she hasn't, because you can walk in just fine. Oops. The king tasks the 4 warriors with rescuing the princess because I guess the rest of his knights weren't particularly good at their jobs, so the warriors proceed to walk about half a mile up to Garland's castle and kill him in 5 hits. With the princess saved, the king rewards the warriors by building a bridge to the outside world, allowing the heroes to continue on their quest. Before leaving, the warriors take a final look back on the castle of Conaria, allowing themselves a final moment of serenity before properly beginning their quest, all while the main Final Fantasy theme plays over them. Gotta give credit where it's due, this is actually a pretty nice moment. Mainly because of the music, but it's still cool regardless, and the closest we ever get to character development in this game. Afterwards, the game mostly involves performing fetch quests until you're able to access the shrines housing the various orbs. The quests can often feel a bit random, but they do connect to each other just well enough to keep the narrative going. As the game progresses, you'll slowly reach each of the shrines and find out why the orbs have been corrupted. That being, they've each been taken over by one of the 4 fiends, each serving as a boss fight. We've got the Fiend of Earth, Lich, the Fiend of Fire, Marilith, who in the original NES version is actually called Carrie, the Fiend of Water, Kraken, and the Fiend of Wind, Tiamat. Once you've beaten them, you purify their orb and you can move on to do some more fetch quests. You return a witch her crystal eye, slay some dinosaurs, mug some pirates for their ship, spend 50 grand on a glass bottle, rescue the mermaids, talk to the robot in the waterfall, and impress some ladies by having legs. As you do. You can also forget about the earth rotting and sea raging, as none of that is ever really shown. The sea seems perfectly sailable to me. Extremely basic stuff, which I can give a pass considering it's the first game in the series, but any future games will not get that luxury. Character-wise, I mean, what characters? Your main party never speak in any way, and don't even have official names. And NPC dialogue is only ever relegated to a single text box. Extremely basic. But, if I can compliment anything, it's that it doesn't drag. The game keeps moving, and it's also relatively short for an RPG, around 12 hours I think, so it's never dull and doesn't overstay its welcome. That's about it for the story though, so let's get into the gameplay. And right off the bat you're given the choice of 6 different classes: the Warrior, Black Mage, White Mage, Red Mage, Black Belt, and Thief. You get a choice of 4 of these classes, though duplicates are allowed. Whatever your choice, these are the 4 classes you get for the entire game, with no way of swapping. So choose wisely. Each of these classes has different unique skills and stats, with each bringing something unique to the table. Well, except the Thief. Jesus, the Thief. Let's just get this out of the way quickly. There's no reason to pick the Thief. They have no unique benefits and are just a weaker fighter in every way. They can't steal anything, despite being a thief. They aren't very strong, and they can't use magic until late in the game. Even then, not very well. They were supposed to make it easier to run away from battles, but guess what? The feature is bugged and doesn't work. What a shame. The rest of the classes do fare considerably better than the Thief, namely the Fighter, who as far as I can tell is the best class in the game. They're extremely strong and can take a beating, as well as having the best equipment in the game. They can't use magic, at least not at first, but their physical skills more than make up for it. Next we have the Black and White Mages. These 2 classes focus entirely on magic, with the White Mage focusing on healing while the Black Mage deals magical attacks. Their physical attacks aren't worth anything and they aren't great at taking hits, but they can be worth having around. Just be careful with them though, because in the original NES version at least, the spells could be a bit flashy. Then there's the Red Mage. This guy is a jack of all trades. They can use white magic, black magic, and can attack physically. They aren't as strong as the Warrior and aren't as powerful as the 2 mages, at least in theory, but it's nice to have someone who can act as a backup, plus they're easily the most stylish. Finally, we have the Black Belt, who starts off about as weak as the mages, but quickly powers up to the point that he can out-damage the fighter. Fun thing about the Black Belt is that they don't need weapons and will perform better bare-handed, so if you're tight with money, this is the class for you. So, what did I pick? Well, for this playthrough, I went with 2 fighters, a red mage, and a black belt. Something fun about Final Fantasy 1 though is that you get to name all of your characters, but in the original release you had a 4-letter limit, so you had to be smart with your names. With that in consideration, I named my first fighter Heat, my red mage Rain, my black belt was called Gale, and my second warrior was Mist. I wanted a more physical oriented party, and there's no way I'm using a thief. The main reason I didn't use dedicated mages though is that this game puts magic users at a bit of a disadvantage. Part of this is due to the magic system, which I'll get more into later, but the game's coding also puts mages at a bit of a loss. In the original release, the intelligence stat doesn't work. This should theoretically increase spells' effectiveness as the game goes on, but since it doesn't work, a heal spell will always heal 30 HP, and only 30 HP, which isn't very helpful as the game goes on. Same going for black magic. Some magic spells such as Temper or Saber also just don't work, and it can also be very difficult to figure out what certain spells do. I mean, Fire, Ice and Heal are straightforward enough, and I'll always love Nuke, but you tell me what Lamp, Ruse, Lock, and XXXX do. I'm sure the mages can be fun, but personally I'll just stick to the red variety, thank ya. Once you've chosen your party members, you are dropped outside Canaria and are left to your own devices, and since this is the first game in the series, I should probably go over the gameplay. Final Fantasy is a turn-based RPG, so there are 2 modes, Exploration Mode and Battle Mode. You start off in Exploration Mode, where you can explore the world map, visit towns, talk to NPCs, and traverse dungeons. In certain areas, however, you will randomly encounter enemies, and will be thrust into the battle screen. Random encounters were necessary due to the technical limitations, but they are a rather outdated system that can be a bit frustrating and hard to stomach. Personally, I've gotten used to them to the point where I don't mind them, provided the encounter rate isn't overly high, but I do fully understand the stigma around them. Once in battle mode, you're placed into this black void, where the characters and enemies face off. This was quite advanced for the time. Most of the other NES RPGs that I haven't played only showed the enemies from a first-person view. This got the job done, but there was a lack of immersion. In this game, you can see all your party members attack, get hit, and die, helping you get a better feel for the battle. Battles are completely turn-based. Once your turn begins, you can spend as many hours as you want procrastinating over what to choose until you eventually decide what to do, whether it be attack an enemy, cast a spell, use an item, or just try to run. Once you've chosen your commands for all of your characters, you watch it all play out and see what happens, with your goal being to wipe out the enemies without being wiped out yourselves. If you succeed, an oh so satisfying victory animation plays, you earn money and experience and get to continue. Earning experience will gradually cause your level to increase, making you stronger and allowing you to combat tougher enemies. Now, before you do anything in this game, make sure to change the respawn rate to anything other than 1. This controls the speed of battles, and at speed 1, every battle drags. Set it to about 6 to have a better time. Something else to remember is that in this game, the original at least, characters won't change targets. In most RPGs, if the monster a character is told to attack dies beforehand, the character will just automatically retarget another enemy, keeping the battle moving. Not here. If the enemy dies beforehand, your character will swing at air, wasting your turn. It's an archaic design choice that I'm glad time has left behind. But, at the same time, I ended up not minding it. It meant I had to plan and judge when it was better to have everyone attack a single enemy or split everyone up. The battle system is antiquated, certainly, and can be off-putting to new players, especially those who are more used to fast-paced action. But it hasn't aged that badly, and can be quite fun in its own right. And that is actually a pretty good summation of this game. Final Fantasy does have plenty of quirks from being an NES game, but they aren't a deal breaker because the game is really well designed. Going in, I was worried I'd need a guide and have to put up with illegible translation, but that wasn't the case. The game is extremely well localized, more so than future games in fact, and it doesn't keep you in the dark. It can help to take a few notes here and there, but there's always an NPC who will give you pointers on what to do. You have to join the dots on your own. but it's satisfying to do. For example, near the beginning of the game, you meet a witch named Matoya, whose crystal eye has been stolen by someone named Astos. Explore further and you'll meet a group of dwarves who need TNT, but the only TNT is stored in Corneria, unlocked by a key held by the elves. You then meet the elves, whose prince has been put to sleep by Astos and needs Matoya's herb to wake up. The elves also tell you whereabouts Astos fled to. So, you head off to beat Astos, obtaining Matoya's eye. Give it to her, she'll give you her herb. Give it to the elf prince, he'll give you his key. Use it to open the strongholds in Corneria, get the TNT, give it to the dwarves, and they will use it to create a canal, allowing you to reach the Earth Shrine. It continues on like this, and while it's basic, it's still charming, and very nice to play an NES game that isn't cryptic. The dungeons are mostly okay too. Some of them are certainly better than others, and there were definitely some sour points. The Earth Cavern, while not bad, requires you to go through it twice, the second time immediately after the first. But my least favourite dungeon had to be the Ice Cave. A part of that may have been because I accidentally went into it a bit too early. I thought it was the Fire Cavern, so I may have been a bit weaker than I should have been. But it was also very confusing layout, and the random encounters are really frustrating here. Especially those wizards. But hey, it at least allowed me to get the airship earlier than expected, and I love the airship. The feeling of freedom it gives you is always one of the best moments of any Final Fantasy game that has them. But aside from those two dungeons, and one other dungeon that I'll get into later, the rest of the dungeons are all quite pleasant. My favourite was the Sunken Shrine. It has a nice atmosphere, the encounters weren't annoying, and the music was beautiful. Also, shoutouts to Mount Gulg. This place is an active volcano which has various patches of lava, which the party must wade through and deliberately take damage, much to their delight I'm sure. It sounds scary, but the lava doesn't hurt you very much, and I swear the random encounter rate was lowered, making it surprisingly fun. It also helped that most, I repeat, most, of the dungeons had teleporters at the end, allowing you to return directly to the overworld. I will admit though that I did use some online maps while traversing, which really broke the Sky Temple in half, let me tell you. The dungeons are well designed, but I'd still rather not spend too long in them for one simple reason. There are no save points in any of the dungeons. Those wouldn't be implemented until Final Fantasy IV. In this game, you can only save by using inns or tents. You can't even save freely on the world map, which is a big shock. So if you get a game over at any point during the dungeon, even if you were right at the end and just at the boss, you need to start all over again, which can be very annoying. In this game, dungeons are endurance tests. Enemies usually aren't too bad on their own, unless they can stun you, but they've got nothing against ganging up on you, sometimes up to 9 at a time. And when that happens, you are guaranteed to take some damage. And in this game, healing is an extremely limited resource. The only ways of healing in this game are to use a potion or cast a healing spell. Potions are what I mostly used, but they will only heal 30 HP at a time, and while the inventory in this game is actually really well handled to my surprise, excluding armor, you can only carry 99 at a time. Now that doesn't sound too bad, but you'd be surprised at how quickly those drain. Potions are the only restorative items in this game. There are no high potions, no ethers, not even elixirs, and when each of your party members has more than 400 health points, a single 30 HP heal potion isn't very helpful. I'd often end up using about 60 of them throughout the course of a dungeon, which would mean I'd always have to restock whenever I got back to a town, with the hilarious part being that you can't order them in bulk in this game, instead must buy each and every potion one at a time. All 99 of them. I really wish there were some more powerful high potions in this game, but there aren't, which got very scary towards the end. The other method of regaining health is casting heal spells, but I don't like doing that for the same reason I don't like using any kind of magic in this game, besides the flashing. It's time to talk about the magic system. This game does not use the traditional Final Fantasy magic system, that being MP. In this game, magic spells are divided into 8 different tiers, each having 3 black spells and 3 white spells. Once they have acquired a spell, mages have a limited number of spell charges that they can use to cast a spell on each tier. They will gain more spell charges as they level up, but frankly, that doesn't matter, because the amount of spell charges given to you even at high levels in this game is tiny, and there is no way of replenishing magic in dungeons in this game. By endgame at level 26, my red mage only had 9 spell charges for tier 1 spells, and the amount decreased further with each tier. This is the real reason I didn't use black or white mages for this playthrough. If the red mage runs out of spell charges, they can still make themselves useful with swords. If a white or black mage runs out of spell charges, they're worthless, and are just waiting to die. Which brings me to the other thing I don't like about this game. Death is a very big deal. This game has no Phoenix Downs. The only way to revive a dead party member is to take them to a town's clinic, which I can't get enough of, hope you bought that medical card, or use a life spell, which is only available halfway through the game and can only be used by a white or red mage. But the best thing about the life spell is that it cannot be used when battling. So how do you revive a down fighter in the middle of the fight? Simple. You don't. You'd better win that battle without them. And if it's your white or red mage that died, then you completely lose access to the life spell, meaning no way of reviving characters whatsoever. Better reset your game or do the very best to continue without them. This is why I used maps for the playthrough. The dungeons were mostly well designed, but if anyone died, I was in trouble. At the same time though, it's not like that ruined the game for me. For the most part, I was able to breeze through this game and have a good time doing it, because for the most part, this game was quite fair. I don't like the magic system, but I was never forced to use it. The game gave me the option to ignore mages and just use physical fighters, and I appreciate that. And while yes, death sucks in this game, it's not something you should experience too often. Outside of the final dungeon, the only time I really suffered from death was during boss fights. Speaking of which, let's talk about the boss fights. This game has 2 types of bosses, the 4 fiends, and the other bosses that don't matter. Yeah, let's get this out of the way. None of the bosses in this game that weren't the 4 fiends gave me any kind of trouble. Garland went down in 5 hits, Astos only managed 2, the vampire couldn't even last 1. Complete pushovers. The 4 fiends, however, were a different story. Now this might have been due to my party setup since I only really had physical attackers, no real substantial healing, and only one character who could do any kind of magic attacks, but the 4 fiends gave me a really hard time. Well, okay, Lich wasn't too bad, he went down pretty quickly, but Carrie, Kraken and Tiamat? Oof. These guys could do up to 400 points of damage with their physical attacks, and had magic spells that hit the entire party. Not to mention being very physically resistant. I was able to do them, but man, they were tough. I mean, from what I've heard, most people find them pretty easy, so maybe I just didn't have the most effective party? Or maybe I'm just bad at the game. But it was always very relieving when I saw that terminated message finally displayed. Got to compliment the sprites though. These guys look pretty good. And on that matter, let's talk about the presentation. Now, this is an 8-bit NES game, obviously it's aged. Animation is extremely limited, they can only use so many colours, and the 8-bit beeps can get a bit irritating. But, you know what? After a couple of hours, I did manage to get used to it, and even grew to like it a bit. The monster sprites are all pretty good, even if they do start recolouring the enemies in less than half an hour in. And while I did find the blackness of the battle area a bit drab, the environments are all nice. Same goes for the music. Nobuo Uematsu is an absolute master of the crafts, and his talents can be seen as early as this game. A lot of songs can be a bit repetitive due to how quickly they loop, and I really don't like the Sky Fortress music, but there's some really nice stuff in here despite it being 8-bit. Mount Gulg is a pretty fun bop. The Chaos Shrine works really well as a final area theme. And then there's my favourite track in the game, the Sunken Shrine. Beautiful. And shout out to the battle theme. Sure, you're going to hear it a lot since it plays during every encounter including the final boss, but somehow it never got old. finally, there are 3 pieces that would become mainstays in the series. The opening theme, the victory theme, and that beautiful main theme. That's mostly it for mainstays though. Coming back to this game, it was surprising just how few of the classic Final Fantasy elements were actually present in the first entry. It has an airship, and a Masamune sword makes its first appearance, but there are no chocobos, no Moogles, no Sage, no Cactars, no Malboros, no Behemoth, it doesn't even use Gil. But it does have an Ochu, which I didn't see coming. Of all the Final Fantasy monsters, I wasn't expecting the Ochu to be the oldest, but it was a nice surprise. But my favourite thing about it is that later on you'll fight an orange recall of it called the Nacho. Poetic. Best enemy name in the game, rivaled only by the Catman. As for optional content, there's not much here. There are only 2 side quests of any sort in this game. One where you find a piece of adamant and give it to a dwarf in return for the awesome Excalibur sword, and then there's the Trial of Bahamut. You can find a set of islands which are really annoying to land on, but inside you'll meet the King of Dragons, Bahamut. Oh, I guess that's one other series mainstay. Whoops. He tasks you with bringing a symbol of courage from the Citadel of Trials, so you fly there, deal with the short teleporter puzzle, and bring back the ultimate show of courage. A rat's tail. It doesn't make any more sense in context, but it doesn't matter because he awards you with a class upgrade, boosting your stats, but more importantly, buffing you up and giving you some crazy eyebrows. The mages become wizards, the thief becomes a ninja, the red mage becomes Zoro, the warrior becomes a rugby player, and the black belt starts a fitness class. Gotta say, best moment in the game, but that's really it for optional side quests. But there is an optional super boss of some sort, that being the War Mech, this steam-powered Metal Gear looking contraption. Now, I say super boss of sorts because it's actually an encounter in the Sky Fortress, which I believe appears on every 64th random encounter. But it certainly feels like a boss since it can take a huge amount of punishment and has some of the nastiest attacks in the game. Look at that. Nuclear. Pretty appropriate considering what it does. I had to grind about 5 levels before I was able to beat this thing, but I'm glad I did because it was extremely satisfying. There's also this hit and slider game, the first ever instance of a Final Fantasy minigame. I solved it in about 2 minutes, but it was pretty cool to see. And yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. So with that, let's get into the endgame. Once the Warriors of Light have gathered all 4 of the orbs, this circle of wizards informs them that it's not over yet, as to truly save the world, they must travel back in time.
Time travel! I see this as an absolute win.
This comes out of nowhere, but regardless, the warriors return to the Chaos Shrine from the beginning of the game, where the orbs flash and send them 2,000 years back in time. Once there, you travel down to the basement, with rematches against the 4 fiends along the way. This dungeon... oh boy, this dungeon. The Chaos Shrine is not nice, and that's due to one thing. The lack of healing. Most of the other dungeons in the game were relatively short, but this one goes on for 8 floors, and it's going to drain your resources fast. I had 99 heal potions before starting it. By the end of it, I had used every last one of them, as well as all of my healing spell charges. This dungeon will test your conservation abilities more than an old school Resident Evil. It doesn't help that the 4 fiends are absolute beasts this time around. Lich and Carrie aren't too bad, although I'd like to have a strong word with whoever taught Lich the nuke spell, but Kraken almost wiped me out, and Tiamat, oh boy, Tiamat. Brutal physical attacks, damaging magic, and an instant death spell. Worst fight in the game in my opinion. War Mech can eat its heart out. Please do yourself a favour and get the Masamune sword before fighting Tiamat, it helps so much. So yeah, I didn't really enjoy this dungeon. If this game had high potions, elixirs and phoenix downs, it would be fine. But it doesn't, and if you die, you have to start all over again. By the time I got to the end of it, I was absolutely dreading the final boss, as I had no heals left at all. But once you reach the end, you finally come face to face with the main villain of the game, the one behind everything. And it turns out to be none other than Garland. Remember him? The guy we beat in 5 hits at the beginning of the game? Remember him? No? Me neither. But he reveals that this entire time he has been in a time loop, where he sends the 4 fiends forward in time, where they send him back in time, so that he can send them forward in time, so that they can send him backward in time, so that he can send them forward in time.
What?
Well, whatever. He laughs at the heroes before transforming into his ultimate form, a massive, hulking god monster with a dragon's head on its crotch known as
Chaos!
Final boss time. I was dreading this fight. I had no heals left, and I remembered finding this guy brutally hard in the PSP version, so I was prepared for the absolute worst. But to my surprise, he was actually a pretty easy, fun fight. I was shocked when that terminated icon suddenly appeared, but the feeling of relief and satisfaction was immeasurable. In fact, I think this may have been my favourite boss in the game. Certainly a great way to go out. So, with Chaos defeated, the time loop is finally broken. Garland and his fiends are erased from the timeline, and the heroes return to the present day to find that none of it ever happened. The fiends never took the crystals, the elements never went out of whack, and no one remembers who the heroes are. So after all that, we don't even get a hero's welcome? Ah. But with that, and the ever-beautiful main theme, Final Fantasy I comes to an end. I like Final Fantasy I. I really do, and I was not expecting to say that. As a Generation Z teen who has already experienced many of the more advanced future titles, I was fully expecting a really hard, tiring game, which I'd regret playing very quickly, especially since I don't remember having a very good time with the PSP remake. But it managed to win me over. Sure, there's not much story or character, the magic system isn't great, healing resources are not plentiful, and death is much more devastating than in any of the future games. But it's also a very well designed game with fun dungeons, good music, good pacing, and a lot of replay value. I went with 2 warriors, a red mage and a black belt this run, but in another playthrough I could swap someone out for a black mage, or a white mage, or even a thief if I wanted a ninja, and each of those playthroughs would be completely different, requiring different strategies. I would describe Final Fantasy I on the NES as solid. It is a solid game that holds up remarkably well for its age, and in the late 80s, I can absolutely see how it spawned the franchise we know and love today. Now, with that said, this game certainly isn't one of my favourites. I like it, but I don't see myself playing it again for a good while, and if I do, it'll probably be with the Pixel remaster, since that version overhauled the graphics, revamped the music, added autosaves, and most importantly, added Phoenix Down's high potions and ethers. And that's probably the version you should play too, if you ever decide to give this game a try. It wasn't this game that made me a fan of the series, and I certainly wouldn't recommend beginning with it. But for what it is, Final Fantasy I is a good game which I do not regret my time with. It's a recommend from me. A recommend with a caveat, but a recommend.